Welcome to Politically Motivated. I'm Christopher Heath.
I'm Lauren Melendez.
Lauren Melendez over there. Last week we opened up with some fun stuff, talking college football. Today, not so much.
What I was going to say, what a difference a week makes.
Yeah, because one of the things that we have seen this week is just how fast the news is moving. Mm-hmm. We try and stick on this show to talking mainly Florida,
right?
But obviously what's going on in Minnesota has injected itself into Florida politics. You had a great interview with Byron Donalds, who is, according to polling, the leading Republican for the GOP nomination for governor.
Right.
And you asked him a lot of good questions about what's going on in Minnesota. And meanwhile, we're also seeing David Jolly, kind of the leading Democrat, take a stance. This is going to shape up to be an issue in the governor's race, you'd have to assume.
Oh, 1,000%. And where he stands on this is going to color exactly how voters feel about him and about how he takes a stance on this issue. So I would say we had a good 15-minute conversation in the journalism world. That's a long time. And I really asked him as much as I could. So I'll jump into ICE and everything unfolding there. But I mean, we talked vaccines, we talked school choice. So when it came to ICE, he's a very conservative lawmaker representing Florida's 19th district, and he made it very clear that he is in support of federal immigration agents. He wants them to know that he supports them. What happened to Renee Good, that was the first fatal shooting of a protester. This was about 3 weeks ago. He stood by their actions, so much in line with Kristi Noem, and then the situation with Alex Preddy.
Now, it's important to know, you did the interview before, after the Good shooting, but before the Preddy shooting.
Right. So I did reach out to him. I did want to ask him about that, too, because I just felt like, my goodness, now the country is dealing with two situations in less than 3 weeks. There's got to be some give here. But, I mean, his biggest thing was that protesters are fueling this, and protesters are getting in the way of federal ICE agents being able to do their job. He said this is a left-wing issue, and when it comes to protesting, they're pushing this agenda, and they need to make sure that they're not in line with agents. They can't get in their way. I pushed back on the notion that Renee Good was actually trying to advance her vehicle. He did agree with what party lines, essentially Republicans saying the evidence is in the video, despite there being a lot of challenges, despite there being so many different analysis of the different angles. And then one thing that I thought was interesting, I asked him about this alleged memo that the ICE director sent out to federal agents, which would allege that agents no longer have to have a warrant to enter someone's home and be able to arrest them. And his clear stance on this is that people who are in this country illegally are not afforded the same rights, constitutional rights that American citizens are. And so as he interprets our Constitution, it applies to you. It applies to me. It does not apply to someone who did not become an American citizen. So that's a really interesting nuance there.
Yeah, and I think it's kind of too clever by half at that point. Right. Because when we get into the question, this is me putting on my law professor hat for a second, the difference between an administrative warrant and a judicial warrant. An administrative, because we're going to go way back to.
But it's helpful to know the difference.
Yeah. So let's dust off the old Constitution for a second here. Article 1 is the legislative branch, Congress. Article 2, that's the president, the executive branch. And then Article 3 is the judicial. And there's always been that separation of powers. So when you think about law enforcement is created by Article 1, but it answers to Article 2. Makes sense. But they can't do things without a sign-off by Article 3. That's a judicial warrant, is a judge has signed off on saying police can enter your home, can take things from you, but a judge has to sign off on this. An administrative warrant is a little more tricky because it comes from the executive branch. So you have the executive branch not only in charge of the law enforcement, but also issuing the warrants. That's why these things are the courts really give these things a side eye and say, you can't just have one branch issuing its own warrants and then executing its own warrants.
Where's the checks and balance, the threshold?
But this is where, when we talk about the administrative warrant, it gets even more sticky because you say, okay, well, if you can't use these, which the administration is saying, yes, we can. Most courts look back at, there's a case called Payton versus New York that says, no, you can't use administrative warrants like this. The issue then becomes remedy. Okay, so I have an administrative warrant and I go into your house and I remove you from your house, and I'm going to remove you from the country. What is your remedy? You can't be put back.
Right.
So normally, like when somebody doesn't, like if a cop comes into your house without a warrant and takes evidence, and you go to court, the remedy would be that evidence gets suppressed. The judge would say, well, you can't have that evidence. You didn't have a warrant. You entered the house illegally. That evidence is being thrown out. In this case, they're not after evidence. They're after a person.
Right.
And so once they've got their hands on the person, there's no remedy to it. So this is a sticky-ish situation. And
he wasn't aware of it. I do want to point that
Yeah.
out. He said he was not aware of that memo. He didn't have any knowledge of it. But all in all, the skinny of it is he supports whatever direction comes from the White House. And that is that federal ICE agents have authority to execute their power in order to remove people who are not in this country legally.
And you look on the other side of that, David Jolly, as I mentioned, the kind of leading Democrat
Right.
in the race for governor. You know, he went as far as to call the shooting of Freddie a murder.
Right.
And I think when you start to look at these two, and I know you talked to Donalds about Renee Good, and obviously Freddie happened after the fact. They're very different situations. I think with the Renee Good one, you can watch the video and you can look at it and you can see the vehicle comes forward and
Right.
you say, okay, does it hit him? Does it not? I would say it's irrelevant at that point because now you're dealing with what is the officer's frame of mind
Right.
with that vehicle. You can say that one. The Good one's a little bit different. And
Freddie
again,
one, you mean?
The Freddie one's a little bit different because again, you watch that video and you start to say, okay, he has a gun, but he's legally allowed to have a gun.
Right.
He has a permit to carry concealed in Minnesota, which is legal. Okay, so now we're all talking about legal stuff. But again, he's on the ground.
Yeah.
What happened? It's the totality of the circumstances. And I think, you're seeing this between the two parties become a bit of a flashpoint. I wonder this, and this is something I want you to kind of percolate on for a second here. We've seen the administration pull back a little bit. Kristi Noem is in the hot seat. You've seen Greg Bovino, his social media
Right.
has been silenced.
Absolutely.
He's been whisked out of Minnesota and sent to California. Tom Homan's been sent in to kind of clean up. You've had all of a sudden these conversations between Governor Walz and President Trump and Tom Homan and Governor Walz and the
Right.
mayor of Minneapolis. You're starting to see the administration maybe look at this and see what has been borne out in some polling that this is not popular. Americans do not like what they're
They don't.
seeing. So do you see this continuing to be kind of a partisan issue, or do you think maybe one side pulls back a bit?
Unfortunately, if I'm honest, I think this will always be a partisan issue because I think Republicans or just conservatives, for the most part, have been so staunchly in support of ICE to the point that what we are seeing play out in terms of Renee Good and Alex Preddy, it almost feels like it's a blind loyalty. And I'm not saying it's right or wrong. It's just based on the outcome. Up until the Preddy situation, up until really just this week, we didn't see much give. And so, as you mentioned, Governor Walz has been very vocal in criticizing President Trump. And we also saw the Minneapolis mayor echo that, right? He had went so far on, federal or national TV and dropped an F-bomb because he was so fed up. So while we're watching the administration walk it back, I think that gives Florida lawmakers all across the country, an opportunity to follow suit, even if they don't agree. The direction it seems like they're taking is of, our Republican president. And so when we see Kristi Noem being in the hot seat for saying things like, Alex Preddy brandished a gun, which is still not been proven. And when we have records or people saying that he was disarmed before he went to go help the woman who was pushed on the ground, and the narrative that he's an ICU nurse, there's sort of this sympathetic picture of him being displayed. And I think that lawmakers on both sides of the aisle can't ignore perception versus reality. So reality is what it is, but the perception among their constituents is that this is two situations that happened so close to each other, and they were both fatal. And now you are seeing an uprising. We're seeing people in Central Florida protest, peacefully albeit, but it's having ripple effects in our backyard. And I hope that it's not a partisan issue, but I think it will be, and it just remains to be seen.
Yeah, and I think as we continue to see, and I think what is so jarring about it is because we are now in a situation, you and I are old enough to remember when Rodney King happened in Los Angeles. And it was kind of unusual that somebody videotaped it.
Right.
Because video cameras were not everywhere. People didn't have cell phone cameras. You actually had to have a real camera and tape inside that camera to record it, and somebody did. And it sparked riots in Los Angeles and civil unrest. We're now in the position where whether we're talking about George Floyd or we're talking about January 6th, or we're talking about what we're seeing in Minnesota right now, everybody has, you and I are sitting here at the table, there's 3 cell phones on the table. Everyone has a camera, and so we're getting multiple angles of these things. We're getting multiple views of these things, and I would say this, one of the things that I think is really cut through is the fact that what we have seen in both of these situations is a narrative gets pushed out initially, and then within 24, 48 hours, videos are dropping on social media here and there, and people are saying, wait, hold on. Here's another angle that shows this. Here's another angle that shows this. And all of a sudden, and it's not just the 2 deaths. It's every time
Right.
something happens.
Right.
Every time a protester gets in the way of law enforcement, or every time law enforcement oversteps its bounds, boom, we have 5, 6, 7 videos
Right.
posted right away. That's cutting through.
I would hope that lawmakers on either side of the aisle, at least if they're not willing to take a position, can say, let's not be so quick to rush to an assumption or rush to a conclusion. Kristi Noem released a statement almost immediately about Renee Good. Kristi Noem released a statement almost immediately about Alex Preddy. And if we want to call a spade, sometimes these investigations do take time. And then we as the media, we come in as journalists and we put pressure on them. But I'd at least appreciate the transparency to say, hey, we've got a ton of video from different angles. We're hearing all sorts of narratives. We believe our ICE agents when they tell us certain things, but we want to do our due diligence and we want to give you the right information as taxpayers. So give us 24 hours as opposed to just jumping in the defense of agents as this issue becomes more polarized. So curious what you think about DeSantis's position, non-position on this.
Yeah, no, he came out obviously and did his usual taking shots at Minnesota and the mayor and the governor up there. But again, within the GOP here in Florida, you mentioned Byron Donalds, but we're also seeing Senator Garcia, South Florida Republican. I mean, she came out very forcefully
Mic drop.
and said, listen, this is not what I voted for. She basically said about the shooting of Alex Preddy. And when you're seeing within the GOP some of that split, I think it's going to eventually become an issue that they have to pull back on and maybe not be so. Yes, we're in favor of law enforcement. Yes, we're in favor of ICE and Customs and Border Protection, but it's not going to be blind loyalty, because at that point, I think you've lost Americans and you've lost the narrative. One quick note on Garcia, obviously South Florida Republicans, as we're talking immigration, everything else. Great reporting out of Politico over the week about many Cubans finding themselves now being rounded up and deported. And Cubans, as you're well aware here in Florida and nationwide, enjoy a bit of a special status when it comes to immigration. And I think as you're seeing the immigration tactics ramp up, as you're seeing the quotas have to be hit by Customs and Border Protection and Homeland Security and ICE and everybody, a lot of people are sitting at this and saying, we voted for secure borders. We voted for an immigration policy. We didn't vote for this.
Right.
That could be an issue.
It really just comes down to how is law and order being interpreted. I mean, one of the things that I did ask Byron Donalds was, if you were elected, if you became Florida's next governor, what would you tell your constituents who did not vote for you in terms of how or to what degree federal ICE agents will be held accountable if they should break the rules or the law? We even saw our president say ICE makes mistakes. And so I think once that admission was made publicly, that's when we started to see, as you pointed out, our top leaders, Kristi Noem and Bovino and folks, sort of walk back some of the harshness that they sort of stormed out of the castle with. And so I said, hey, look, if a federal agent does something that is not in accordance with what was given at the top, are you going to hold them accountable? And he said yes. What that means, I don't know, but he did say they are subject to the same laws that we are.
They are, but I mean, it would be hard. I mean, this is where the supremacy clause gets in the way, because this would be, even if you brought state charges. And I saw some of this on social media where, they were saying, well, that the Attorney General of Minnesota should arrest these Customs and Border Patrol agents and arrest these ICE agents. And I'm like, he can try. The moment they do, there will be a filing and it will be removed to federal court, and the federal court system will basically take it from there. So no, the states, when it comes to this area of the law, immigration is one of those things that is relegated to the federal government. It is not going to be covered by the 10th Amendment to the Constitution as an unenumerated power. So therefore, boom, it goes out. So anyway, okay.
I can tell you one thing. If another situation, because this was the second fatal, but remember we had in between that, we had the shooting of a gentleman in his leg who they did say charge at a federal agent. But again, it just goes to show how heightened this issue is and how it's playing out. So if there is something else, within the next 2 weeks, I can guarantee you this will be another conversation again, and something's going to have to change.
All right. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we'll talk voting.
Yes.
We will talk a little bit about vaccines and maybe something fun at the end, but I can't guarantee it. Stay with us.
Politically motivated, Heath, Lauren Melendez. If you are just tuning in, we spoke all things ICE and the situation unfolding in Minneapolis, how that affects us here in Florida. But now we want to start with the government shutdown. This is like the phrase that keeps on giving. It used to be sort of once in a blue moon, and now we see Congress is barreling toward another one. If you don't really follow what's happening, our federal government is funded through just about, I think, maybe Monday, whatever day January 30th is. And then, federal agents will not have money. Our government has to be funded by money. And there was a package that was approved by the House, and the Senate said no, specifically most Democrats, because of immigration issues. And how the heck are they going to support the Department of Homeland Security? They did not like what happened just recently in Minneapolis, the killing of ICU nurse Alex Preddy. And so they said, wait, we're not going to pass this funding package until we figure out how and what money is going to DHS, because we don't like what they're doing.
You know, a lot happened. You mentioned there, a lot happened really, really fast. You have the House pass a basically extension to keep the government the lights on, and they send it off to the Senate. Now the House is not in session right now, so we're kind of left with whatever they sent over to the Senate. And after it's sent to the Senate, that's when we have the killing of Alex Preddy, and the reaction from Democrats was almost immediate to start whipping votes, because it's going to take 60 votes in the Senate to pass this. Republicans only have 53, so they're going to need 7 Democrats to sign on. And Chuck Schumer and other leadership on the Democratic side said, we'll pass almost everything you've given us to keep the government funded, but we will not pass this ICE portion. We will not pass this Homeland Security supplemental, which, by the way, Homeland Security in the bill that was passed during reconciliation earlier last year, the big, beautiful bill, got a ton of cash. So they're not in desperate
they're not
need.
hurting.
They're not going to run out of money anytime soon. I believe the funding is something like larger appropriation than what the Israeli military has. So it's a lot of money.
That's perspective.
So they're not desperate for cash, but this is going to be an issue, and Democrats are now looking at, as we mentioned earlier, they're looking at the polling, they're looking at what their constituents are saying, they're looking at what their voters are saying, which is, we want you to fight, and they're going to say, okay, here's where we're drawing the line. And yeah, we could be hurtling to yet another government shutdown, which is, again, the most avoidable problem in the world.
Sorry,
it's
hilarious in a scary way.
And yet here we are. So,
voting rolls.
Fun times, yes. Out of all of this, we're staying in Minnesota for another second, but we're going to bring in former Florida Attorney General Pam Bondi for this one. She sends a letter to Minnesota and basically lays out, like, get ready for sanctuary city policies and this, and this. And then, oh, by the way, we want your voter rolls.
Right. Why? What's that for?
We want to know who's on your voter rolls. Now, the administration has provided no evidence that there's widespread fraud in Minnesota, but basically they're saying, listen, we want the full voter rolls, partial Social Security numbers for purposes TBD. And, you know, you look at Minnesota's response to this was, this is a ransom note. This is basically you saying, hey, we sent thousands of, you know, Homeland Security, Border Patrol, ICE agents into your city. We're causing all sorts of disruption there. But you know what? They can all go away if you just give us these voter rolls. And so this is
a scary flex. And I think it is an example based on just facts alone. Like you said, this has nothing to do with voting. There's no alleged fraud. There's no problem. It's just a power grab. And there's no other way to really interpret it. It doesn't matter if you're a Republican or a Democrat. It's very unconstitutional.
It's very, I think when you look at this, you say, well, hold on, what is the end game here? What does the Justice Department need with this voter information? What is the plan for it? Because, again, if you could point to and you could show there is widespread voter fraud and we can point to these issues, but that's just never been entered into evidence. And people will always anecdotally say, well, you know, I heard this happen or I saw this happen. One-offs do happen.
Right.
You know, as somebody who's covered elections for more than 2 decades, there is voter fraud out there.
Right. But you have to justify it. You have to present information and evidence.
But of the scale to influence an election, no. And of the scale that is often sometimes purported, no. And so this is where, you know, I think when you look at what is happening in Minnesota and the letter from Bondi, I think, again, it adds another wrinkle to it and just complicates the situation.
I feel like
more.
Minnesota can't get a break. You were talking about some notes here. One of nearly 24 states that the Justice Department is suing for its full unredacted voter file. They want partial Social Security numbers, full dates of birth, driver's license numbers. So I want to just highlight when we talk about voter file what that is, because this is very specific personal information. And then where is it going? How is it being used? Who's going to have access to it? If you're going to ask for something like that with little to no evidence of fraud, at least be able to describe or justify where it's going.
Exactly. And again, I mentioned our favorite friend, the 10th Amendment, but elections are one of the things that the states handle. The feds do not have a role in carrying out elections. So this is, we'll see where this one goes.
Okay.
But, all right, let's return to the Sunshine State.
Vaccines.
And vaccines, yes. The legislature moving forward with more exemptions and carve-outs for vaccines. Walk us through a little bit of this.
Well, first of all, this issue is not something that we can seem to get a grasp on. So I want to dive in. A bill expanding vaccine exemptions you mentioned for Florida school kids cleared its first Senate committee. This was Monday, despite a lot of pushback from health advocates and actually 2 Republicans. So I wanted to get in the weeds here. SB 1756, this is sponsored by Senator Clay Yarborough. It would let parents claim a personal conscience exemption. And we talked a little bit about this last week in terms of people having very specific reasons for not wanting to vaccinate their kids or not vaccinate themselves. And obviously when it comes to kids, that's the priority here because we're talking about schools. Whether it's religious reasons, personal reasons, this would give them the support and say, hey, look, you can make that decision. We trust your expertise. We're not going to force this on you.
We talked about this last week because we were discussing polling that had come out. It was a Gallup poll that came out, and since then we've had another one by McLaughlin Associates, and it's showing the same thing. This is an issue that overwhelmingly Democrats are opposed to lifting these vaccine mandates. Independents are opposed, not quite as high numbers as Democrats, to lifting mandates, but even a majority of Republicans are opposed to lifting these vaccine mandates. I think 79% of likely, 79% of likely voters would support maintaining current school vaccine requirements, only 17% opposing them. That is, I mean, we talk about an 80-20 issue. This is an 80-20 issue, and yet the legislature seems to be on the 20% side. And we've always had religious exemptions. We've always had different exemptions in there, but to expand this out at the same time that you're seeing the governor and Surgeon General Ladapo start to roll back other requirements, there's a legitimate concern out there that what does Florida look like in 2, 3, 4, 5 years as we lose that kind of herd immunity that we have built up for some of these just terrible diseases that are preventable.
I feel like Florida and Texas have long been those states that kind of just do their own thing, and they set some major precedents, whether they're good or scary or concerning. If we see Florida take the stance of, hey, we're going to take away those mandates, we're going to take away the way things have been done, and have vastly, by the numbers, protected students in school and let parents make choices, then how far does that go, right? What do those exemptions look like? How do you get one? Who's going to be the one to make the decision? Because to me, it seems very subjective. I don't know if you have to say, or you have to show a certificate that you're baptized, you have to show that somebody in your family got sick from a vaccine. At what point, and I know this is really nuanced, do we have some sort of rubric or guidance to say, this is how many we are allowing, this is why? Because again, when we talk about herd immunity, we are talking about measles making a return for the first time in the U.S. in decades. Our own newsroom got hit probably with the super flu bug, right? I mean, the flu isn't as scary to us today as it used to be, but I think that's because of the herd immunity and the fact that we have gotten information and we have followed guidelines from the CDC about how to protect ourselves against it. You start proposing bills in Congress that say, yeah, we'll let mom and dad choose. I'm not telling folks they don't have the right, but I think there needs to be more information. And this is what a lot of even Republican legislators said. We're playing with fire before we have enough evidence to really claim that that's a good idea.
One of the things that jumped out at me was that it requires providers to discuss vaccine risks and benefits. And this gets into an area called compelled speech. And the government can compel you to do and say certain things. The reason why cigarettes have to have that warning on, that's considered compelled speech. Would this fall into that? Now, we medical providers are allowed to provide medical, information, and if they don't agree that there are specific risks, but the state is mandating them, could medical providers have a leg to stand on and say, this goes too far. You cannot tell me I have to say this to my patient if I don't agree with it from my medical perspective. I think there's some issues in this beyond just the fact that it seems like Floridians, for the most part, don't like where the state's going on this issue. To some of the problems with this bill. It's early on.
It is.
I was.
Nothing's happening tomorrow.
No, I was. When we get these pieces of legislation, when they get filed, they go through committees. They get rewritten. We have committee substitutes for committee substitutes. Changes get made, so things could change on this. But the direction it's going, I think again, this is one where the public is saying, "Listen, we want as parents." We want to be able to make decisions, but I don't like where you're going. You've taken a good idea of giving us more agency as a parent, and gone a little too far,
Right.
because I'm concerned about where this ultimately ends up.
Exactly. I just want to quickly highlight something. It's slightly off the beaten path, but we had this week, our Florida Governor Ron DeSantis and Latipo talk about what they discovered in candy and Nerds and Jolly Ranchers, and the fact that it had raised arsenic levels. This was a big deal on the morning show yesterday, and I'm just pointing out the fact that if you're going to tell folks, hey, you shouldn't be doing this, you shouldn't be eating Nerds, which you probably grew up eating, you shouldn't be eating Jolly Ranchers, we should probably tell you why. And we should probably be able to hold a press conference and give you factual information that has been garnered by studies and by bodies of evidence. So taking that and then sort of in line with the vaccine proposals, repealing these mandates, give people evidence, give them numbers, give them something to chew on before we just decide, hey, let's repeal it.
And I go back to something that I remember interviewing at the time Senator Marco Rubio during the beginning of the pandemic, and he says to me, he goes, well, you shouldn't be getting medical advice from politicians, you should be getting medical advice from your doctor. Mm-hmm. And I think this gets to the idea of we tend to have politicians that want to do everything. Tallahassee has a wonderful ability to want to make decisions for everyone. Mm-hmm. And maybe just stay in your lane, fix the potholes.
Isn't that why we have experts?
Keep the streetlights on. Let doctors do doctor stuff.
Yeah.
But no. They get together for their little 60-day session and
little 60-day
decide
session.
that they want to do all kinds of fun stuff.
Well, they better slow down because they got a lot to do, and we need some funding.
We do. Okay, so we are wrapping.
At our time?
We're getting to the end of this thing. I would say this. We kind of started off on a bit of a sour note with discussing what's going on in Minnesota and the tragedy that's happening there. And I to kind of put a pin in it as being, all that's cutting through and all that's being talked about. There is, I think, in this country right now, a sense of what's going on. And people are, I think, fundamentally watching this and wondering what happens next.
Right.
And, I think increasingly it's important to break out of your bubble, break out of your silo, find, information that is, and maybe disagrees with your, preconceived notions, and challenge yourself to go to first principles. And I think at the end of the day, it's going to be incumbent upon all of us to try and educate ourselves and get good information and not just what conforms with what we already believe.
And it's a good reminder for us as journalists. We do this podcast to bring information to people where they are. We don't want you to have to scroll through a bunch of bills and try to figure out what that word means. We want you to know what your lawmakers are suggesting and how it affects you and how soon it could affect you. So, yeah.
Lauren, always a pleasure. When we do this again next Wednesday?
8:30.
Thank you to Kath Lee.
All of our friends behind the scenes that make us look really good. So, News 6 Plus. Hope you'll join us next time, 8:30 next week on Wednesday. See you then.